Apache woman's tribe shamed her for being strikingly curvy, but he loved her no matter what.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Texas frontier, November 1882. The cabin sat alone at the edge of a dry valley, 2 miles from the nearest wagon trail, backed by a line of mesquite trees and brittle grass that hadn't seen rain in weeks. The man who lived there, Jonas Hale, didn't speak to folks if he didn't have to. Hadn't been to town in over a month. There was no reason to. He grew what he needed, hunted what he couldn't grow, and hadn't let another soul step inside his cabin since the death of his wife 5 years ago. He was 35, thick-shouldered, built from work. Grief had worn his face early, carved deep lines beside his mouth, above the bridge of his nose. His beard was rough, his shirt unbuttoned to the collar, sweat damp from hauling logs to the shed. His right shoulder still gave him trouble when it rained. His wife had died with their first child, bled out before the midwife made it. He buried both on the hill behind the barn, planted a cottonwood that never grew tall. Since then, he lived in silence. That morning, he noticed buzzards circling far off near the trees but thought little of it. Could have been a coyote carcass, maybe a cow that wandered too far. But just before dusk, something made him stop. He was carrying a half-load of firewood in his arms, sweat burning down his back, when he saw movement near the edge of the brush. Not an animal. Human. A figure stumbling, barefoot, slow, leaning hard on one leg. The figure collapsed forward in the dirt. Jonas dropped the wood, reached for the rifle by the door out of habit, but didn't raise it. He stepped off the porch. His boots kicked up dry dust as he walked. Closer now, he could see it was a woman. Her skin was bronze, her dark hair long, tangled, falling over her face. Her dress, deerskin, native-made, was torn in several places. The neckline had been ripped, hanging low and exposing the curve of her cleavage, the round of her breast pressed under the edge of torn fabric. The side seams near her hips were split, stretched too tight against full curves. She was covered in dirt, and one leg bore old bruises. Her breathing was shallow. Her eyes were half closed. She wasn't just hurt. She was dying slowly from thirst, hunger, exposure. Jonas lowered to one knee. "Can you hear me?" She flinched at the sound of his voice. Her eyes opened a little more, and he saw the fear behind them. She looked ready to run if her body would obey. But it wouldn't. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Jonas said, his voice steady but quiet. "You're safe." He didn't ask what she was doing here. That could come later, if she lived. He slid one arm under her shoulders and the other under her knees. She tensed as he lifted her. Her weight surprised him, not because she was heavy, but because she had none left to hold herself up. Her head dropped against his chest. Her body was warm with fever. As he carried her toward the cabin, he felt her shift in his arms. One arm tried to hold the fabric of her dress across her chest. She was trying to keep her dignity, even now. Inside, the cabin was dim but clean. He laid her gently on the bed, careful not to let the blanket slip too low off her chest. She coughed once, weak and dry. Her breathing was ragged. Jonas crossed to the wash basin, poured clean water into a cup, and brought it back. He crouched beside the bed and held it to her lips. "Drink," he said. She hesitated. Her eyes flicked between his face and the cup, weighing whether she could trust him. Then she took a sip, swallowed, took another. "What's your name?" he asked. A pause. Her voice came out hoarse. "Sanaa." That was all she said. He set the cup down, then pulled a blanket over her. Her dress was barely holding together. Her legs were scratched, feet blistered. Her chest rose and fell too fast. He got up again, ladled hot stew from the cast-iron pot over the fire. Beans, dried meat, squash. It wasn't much, but it was warm. He returned, offered it. She reached for the spoon with shaking fingers. She tried to eat without making a sound. Jonas watched from the table. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. But his mind worked through the details. Apache, probably from a camp up north. Clearly cast out. And recently, he saw the bruises under the dirt. He saw the way she refused to cry. When she finished, he took the bowl. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but the words didn't come. You can stay here tonight, he said. Rest. She looked away. Her voice was quieter when she spoke again. They said I was too much. My body made the men look. Jonas didn't answer right away. He sat at the edge of the bed, far enough to give her space. Your people turned you out? He asked. She nodded once. Her eyes welled up, but didn't spill over. They said I brought shame, that I didn't belong. Jonas took a breath. He looked at her, not at her exposed skin, not at the torn dress or her full hips under the blanket. He looked at her eyes, at the anger behind them, the hurt she was fighting to swallow. You didn't bring shame, he said flatly. That ain't your fault. Sanaa stared at him, unsure if she believed him. But she didn't speak again. Jonas stood. You'll sleep in the bed. I'll take the floor. She didn't argue. As he stepped away, he paused near the door, glanced back at her once more. She was curled under the blanket now, eyes half closed, breathing slow. He stepped outside and shut the door behind him. The sun had set. Coyotes howled in the distance. Jonas leaned against the porch post, arms crossed, looking out into the dark. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, someone needed shelter, and he had more than enough of it to give. Jonas was up before the sun, as always. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals, and the cabin was cold. He stepped quietly around the bed, not wanting to wake her, though he didn't need to try hard. Sanaa hadn't moved much through the night. Her breathing had been uneven at first, light and quick like a trapped animal, but sometime before dawn, it had evened out. She was still asleep, curled beneath the wool blanket, her face turned toward the wall. A lock of her dark hair had fallen across her cheek. She looked younger now, softer than she had the night before, less guarded. The rise and fall of the blanket over her chest was slow and steady. Jonas moved around the room, stoking the fire, boiling coffee, and mixing cornmeal for breakfast. His movements were quiet, practiced. He didn't glance at her often, but he was aware of her every breath. By the time the sun crept through the gaps in the shutters, he heard her shift. Her voice came a minute later, dry and cautious. Where am I? Jonas poured 2 mugs of coffee. My land, south of Dry Fork. She pushed herself up slowly, careful to keep the blanket around her shoulders. Her dress had shifted again in the night, one strap barely clinging to her shoulder, the neckline dipping dangerously low. She pulled the blanket tighter. Dry Fork's 2 days north, she said. Jonas set the mug on the trunk beside the bed. That's right. She looked around the room. Barewood walls, a single shelf lined with dried herbs and tools, a table with 2 chairs, his coat hanging by the door. It was a man's space. Warren lived in. Not cruel, just quiet. You live here alone? I do. She nodded slowly. How long? He paused before answering. 5 years. Sanaa watched him, eyes sharper now. She wasn't just awake. She was trying to understand him. Understand why a stranger had carried her into his home, fed her, let her sleep in his bed without touching her. You didn't ask me where I came from. No, he said simply. Didn't seem right to press. There was silence. She lifted the mug, hand still unsteady, and drank. When he brought over a plate of corn mush and cooked beans, she looked at it, then at him. You feed all strangers this well? Only the ones who collapse on my land. It earned him a small, unexpected smirk. Quick, almost invisible, but it was there. She ate slowly. He sat across from her, drinking his coffee, not saying more than needed. After breakfast, she stood on her own for the first time since arriving. Her legs wobbled but held. She kept the blanket wrapped around her but walked toward the door, barefoot. Jonas watched her pause at the threshold. The morning was cold. She looked out at the land. Rolling brush, low mountains far off, the barn standing quiet near the corral. There was nothing else. No voices. No signs of life, but birds. She whispered, It's quiet here. Yeah, I don't hear the river. Or the drums. Jonas stepped up beside her. You miss it. She didn't answer right away. No, she said finally. Not anymore. She stood silent for a long moment, arms drawn around herself, watching the sky. Then she asked what Jonas knew would come sooner or later. Why did you help me? He rubbed a hand over his beard. Thought about lying. Decided not to. You needed help. I was thrown out, she said, her voice flat. They said I took too much. Drew too much attention. Men looked, and the elders blamed me. Her words didn't shake, but her hand clutched the blanket tight at her chest. He looked at her, not just her shape or the curve of her hips outlined under the blanket. He saw the way she braced herself, ready to be shamed again. Dismissed. You didn't ask for that attention, he said. No. You didn't do anything wrong. No. Then what happened to you? He said. Ain't on you. She looked at him for a long time after that. Inside, Jonas pulled an old pair of boots from the trunk. Smaller. Belonged to his wife once. He set them near the bed without comment. He also found a flannel shirt and a spare petticoat. She would need something warmer soon. When he turned back, she was still by the door. She didn't cry, didn't thank him. She just said, quiet and plain, I don't want to be sent away again. Jonas stared at her, then gave the first answer that came honest. Then don't go. She looked down. Her throat moved. Her voice, when it came, was more fragile than before. You don't even know me. He nodded. You don't know me either. They didn't speak after that. Not for the rest of the morning. Jonas went out to the barn, fed the horses, cut wood, hauled water. She stayed inside, mostly, wrapping herself in the blanket, moving slowly from the bed to the fire. She tried to help. He noticed that. She swept the floor with his old broom without being asked. She cleaned her bowl and his. When she folded the blanket later, he saw her glance at the boots, but she didn't put them on. That evening, they ate together again. Still no questions. Still no demands. But when he rose to take the plates, her hand brushed his. He froze. It was only a second, just her fingers touching his wrist. But it was enough. He looked at her. She looked away. Later, he rolled out a bedroll near the hearth. She lay down on the bed again, the blanket pulled up around her shoulders. Her hair loose down her back. As he settled into the bedroll, she spoke once more. If I stay, she said, I'll work. I won't be a burden. Jonas stared at the ceiling. You already helped, he said. I hadn't spoken this much in years. She didn't answer, but the silence between them didn't feel like distance anymore. It felt like something beginning, quiet, careful, and real. The next morning, the wind picked up early, rattling the shutters and dragging dust along the valley floor. Jonas rose before sunrise as usual. He dressed quietly, boots scraping the floor as he stepped into them, coat tugged over his shoulders. He didn't light a lamp. He didn't need to. He moved by habit now, by years of the same motion. He looked toward the bed. Sanaa was awake, though still lying on her side, watching him in the dim blue-gray light. Her eyes weren't heavy with sleep, just alert. She hadn't let herself fully relax yet. He understood that. You sleep all right? He asked, voice low. She nodded once. Yes. He didn't ask anything else. Just poured coffee into 2 tin mugs, set one near the hearth where she could reach it if she wanted, and stepped out into the cold. Outside, the frost clung to the grass. The horses stirred in the barn. The world was quiet. Jonas's boots crunched over frozen dirt as he hauled wood from the stack, fixed the pump handle that kept jamming, and scattered feed for the chickens. His shoulder ached, same as it always did in the cold. He paused once to stretch it out, eyes on the horizon. He hadn't told her yet how long he'd been alone. Not really. Not just years, but what that time meant. How he stopped visiting neighbors. How folks stopped inviting him places after a while. How grief turned into routine, and routine hardened into a wall. When he came back in, she was sitting up in bed, sipping the coffee. She'd put on the shirt and petticoat he'd left for her the night before. The flannel hung loose on her shoulders, the top buttons open where her curves filled out the space, the neckline slipping slightly to one side. It was the first time she wasn't clutching a blanket to hide herself. She still watched him carefully, though, testing whether she was still welcome. He set down a bundle of firewood beside the stove. You warm enough? She nodded. You'll need a coat soon. Nights will get worse. I can sew, she said quietly. If you have fur or cloth, I can patch it together. He met her eyes. How about hides? Some thread. You can have at it. She looked down into the mug. I'm not good with idle hands. That answer told him more than she realized. They ate together again, bread from the last of the flour, boiled beans, and jerky. She didn't eat like she had the first day. She was slower now, not from weakness but caution. There was a return of control in her posture. That same careful pride he'd seen when she first opened her eyes in the dirt. When breakfast was done, Jonas gathered tools for fence repair. Before he could say anything, Sanaa stood up. I want to help. He hesitated. You sure? I'm not made to sit indoors all day. Jonas didn't argue. He handed her a pair of worn gloves, big on her fingers, but usable. She slipped on the boots slowly. They fit better than expected, if a little loose. As they stepped outside, she squinted into the sun. The wind tugged at her hair, loose and long, strands catching on her lips. She didn't flinch. She followed him to the pasture. Most of the morning passed in work. They didn't talk much. She held the rails steady while he hammered nails. He pointed toward posts that needed straightening, and she moved without needing to be told twice. When the hammer slipped and smashed his thumb, she was the one who grabbed his hand, unthinking, pressing his fingers in her own. You all right? She asked, voice sharp, concerned. He didn't pull away, just nodded once. Yeah, just stupid. She didn't let go right away. When she did, it was slower than necessary. Later, they sat in the shade of the fence. He handed her a canteen. She drank and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. He asked, You have family? Sanaa hesitated. Then, after a pause, My mother died 2 winters ago. My father doesn't speak to me. I have 2 older brothers, both married. They wouldn't say a word for me when the elders held council. What about the man they said you tempted? Her face turned hard. He was one of the elders' sons. He wanted me to be quiet about what he did. When I refused, they said I made myself available. That my shape was a distraction. That I walked wrong, sat wrong, breathed wrong. Jonas didn't speak. His jaw tightened, but he let her keep going. They told me I had a hunger in me, that I brought shame by existing the way I do. He looked at her fully now. You didn't do anything wrong. I know that now, she said. But I didn't then. I thought maybe I'd gone mad, that maybe my body was cursed. Jonas took a slow breath. I buried my wife in 77, he said after a long pause. She was full with our first. The baby didn't make it either. Sanaa looked at him carefully. She didn't interrupt. I stayed here after. Folks tried to visit, bring food. But after a while, I stopped answering the door. I figured I wasn't good company for anyone. You still aren't, she said. He gave a short breath, close to a laugh. She gave the faintest smile. Then quiet returned between them. That afternoon, Sanaa stitched the sleeve of his coat where it had frayed. He brought her furs to work into something heavier. She sat by the fire, focused, hands steady, lips pressed together in concentration. Her chest rose and fell beneath the flannel shirt, which still hung open in places, revealing the top of her bust as she leaned over her stitching. Jonas noticed it but didn't stare. Still, something in him shifted just slightly. He hadn't thought of another woman that way in years. He hadn't let himself. As evening fell, they stood together on the porch. The sky was a deepening red. She held a blanket around her shoulders again, but her posture was no longer guarded, just tired. You planning on going anywhere? He asked. She didn't turn her head. Is there anywhere else to go? He thought a moment. No. Then no, she said. He looked down at her, the shape of her figure lit by the fading sun. She didn't shrink under his gaze, didn't cover herself. She let him look, and he didn't look away. The wind didn't let up the next morning. It came down hard from the north, cold and sharp. Jonas wrapped a scarf around his neck before stepping outside. Sanaa followed close behind, dressed now in a makeshift coat she had sewn from patched hides. It fit her well enough, tight around the chest, drawn at the waist with a strip of leather. Her curves filled it fully, and she didn't hide that anymore. She held her head high. The barn roof needed fixing. A few shingles had peeled back in the wind. Jonas fetched the ladder while Sanaa gathered tools. He hadn't asked for help, but she moved beside him anyway, sleeves rolled, hair braided back and tied with leather. The shirt she wore beneath the coat dipped at the collar, revealing the top of her chest with every lean or reach. She didn't adjust it. Not once. Not to hide. Not to invite. She simply worked. When they finished, Jonas climbed down and set the hammer aside. You learn to patch roofs where you're from? He asked. My uncle built homes near Fort Mason, she said. He let me carry nails when I was small. Said hands that build are worth more than mouths that talk. Jonas nodded. He was right. They stood in the cold silence for a moment, both of them looking out at the bare field. Then she asked the question he'd been expecting. You ever think about leaving this place? He paused. No, not in a long while. Why not? Because I made this with my hands, he said, glancing toward the cabin. I buried my wife on that hill. My whole life's right here. She didn't respond right away. Then, you didn't bury yourself with her. No, he said, but I tried to. They didn't speak for the rest of the morning. By midday, Sanaa had pulled a chair near the fire inside the cabin, stitching more leather patches while Jonas sharpened tools at the table. The cabin had taken on a new feeling, one he hadn't recognized at first. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It felt lived in, comfortable. At some point, he glanced at her, and she was already watching him. You keep staring, she said. You keep looking back. Her lips curved slightly. Do I make you nervous? Jonas took a slow breath. You make me think about things I stopped thinking about. She looked down at the coat she was patching. Like what? Like what it means to share a home again. She was quiet. Her fingers moved carefully, stitching along the edge of a sleeve. Then, without looking up, I'm not a wife. I didn't say you were. I've never been one. He set the knife down. You don't have to explain yourself to me. She met his eyes again. I want to. Eventually. Jonas didn't push. He stood, walked to the shelf, pulled down a tin of coffee. You want some? Yes, she said, but only if you'll sit across from me when I drink it. He poured 2 mugs, set them both on the table. She joined him a moment later. They drank in silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. That night, he didn't unroll his bedroll by the hearth. Instead, as the cabin darkened and the fire dropped to glowing embers, Sanaa stood from the chair and walked toward the bed. She didn't say anything, just turned back, looked at him, then pulled back the covers and sat. Jonas stood by the fire, still wearing his shirt, hands open at his sides. He didn't move until she reached for his wrist. You said I didn't do anything wrong, she said softly. But I want to know, if I choose to be touched, does that make it right? He met her gaze, steady. Only if it's what you want. She didn't answer out loud. She leaned in and kissed him, slow, unsure at first. Her lips were soft, her breath warm. She kissed him like she hadn't been allowed to kiss anyone before. When she pulled back, she didn't explain herself. She didn't ask for permission. Jonas stepped closer, sat beside her. She reached for his hand and placed it just above her hip under the coat. They didn't speak again that night. But when she lay down beneath the blanket and he joined her, pulling her gently into his chest, her body fit against his like she'd always been meant to be there. The firelight flickered across her bare shoulder as she didn't flinch when he touched her skin. What had started as silence between strangers had turned into something else entirely, something slow, grounded, real. Neither of them said the word love, but it was there, in the way she didn't ask to stay anymore, and in the way he no longer imagined the bed without her in it. Morning came slow and gray. The sky hung heavy with low clouds, hinting at rain though none came yet. Inside the cabin, it was warm. The fire had been kept through the night, low but alive, casting faint orange across the walls. Jonas stirred first. He was on his side, one arm under the pillow, the other draped across Sanaa's waist. Her back was to him, her breathing soft, her body, curved, full, warm against his, moved gently with each breath. The blanket had shifted sometime during the night, exposing one of her shoulders and the upper line of her spine. He stayed still a while longer, eyes open, letting the quiet settle. She shifted then, only slightly, enough to let him know she was awake too. You regret it? She asked, voice low. No. She turned her head toward him. I don't either. He moved his hand from her hip to her arm. You don't owe me anything for last night. I know, she said. Then after a pause, but I gave it freely. They lay still for several minutes after that, wrapped in warmth that came from more than the fire. Eventually, they rose. She pulled the coat around her, belted it at the waist, her hair still tousled from sleep. Jonas watched her cross to the basin and splash water on her face. She looked different now, not because of what had happened between them, but because she no longer carried herself like she was waiting to be sent away. She moved as though she belonged. As she dried her face, she asked, Do people come here often? No, ever. Only if they're lost, or trying to sell something. She leaned against the table. Then they don't know I'm here. No, Sanaa looked down, thumb brushing the rim of a tin cup. I don't want to be found. They won't. Still, the question was out now, spoken between them, even if she didn't say it outright. The world outside hadn't disappeared. There were people out there who knew her. People who had judged her body, discarded her as a burden, and might not be finished with her yet. Jonas saw the worry creep into her eyes. She didn't voice it again, but he felt it sitting in the air between them. Later that day, she gathered the dried hides and fabric scraps and began working on more permanent clothes. Fitted sleeves, warmer stitching, a proper winter layer. She worked by the fire while Jonas repaired the chicken coop and replaced a broken fence post. When he came back inside, she was bent over the table, thread pulled taut between her fingers. The shirt she wore hung open near the top again, slipping low as she leaned forward, revealing the gentle swell of her breasts. Jonas looked just for a second too long, and she noticed. She didn't cover herself. Instead, she looked at him, steady and open. He crossed the room, rested his hand on her shoulder. You want something to eat? I could eat. He made a meal. Thick cornbread, beans, and slices of salted pork fried in a pan. When they sat down to eat, Sanaa asked, You ever think about what happens if someone does come? If someone asks why I'm here, I'd tell them you're where you belong. What if they don't believe it? Jonas chewed slowly, swallowed. Then they can go to hell. Sanaa held his gaze. Would you protect me? He didn't blink. Yes. That night, after they cleaned up, she stood by the fire brushing her hair with a bone comb she found in one of his drawers. The flames lit her face, the smooth line of her neck, the roundness of her hips under the coat. Her curves, once a source of shame, now moved without apology. She belonged to herself, and yet, the way she looked at him carried something else, trust. You still have your wife's grave? She asked softly. Yes, he said, up behind the barn. She's buried beside the child. Sanaa turned toward him. Would you take me there sometime? Tomorrow, he said. She walked toward him slowly, hands loose at her sides. You said you hadn't thought about sharing a home again. Do you now? He didn't answer with words. He stepped closer and kissed her, slow, certain. Not rushed. His hand settled at her waist, the other resting lightly against the side of her neck. When they pulled apart, she whispered, I'm not a ghost from your past. I know, he said. You're something else. They didn't go to bed right away. They sat by the fire a while, her head resting against his shoulder, his fingers laced with hers. Outside, wind moved through the trees. The world remained uncertain. But in that moment, nothing felt unfinished. And for the first time in years, Jonas Hale didn't feel alone in his own home. The next morning, fog hung low across the field like breath that hadn't yet lifted. The trees beyond the barn were barely visible. The ground was damp and quiet, sound softened under the weight of mist. Sanaa stood wrapped in her patched coat, hair braided neatly, boots laced tight. She waited by the door as Jonas pulled on his heavier jacket and slung a worn wool blanket over his shoulder. They didn't speak as they made their way behind the barn. The grass was wet beneath their steps. Sanaa walked slightly behind him, not out of fear, but out of respect. She understood this was something sacred. The grave markers weren't ornate, just two wooden crosses, one taller than the other, weathered by years of sun and wind. Jonas stopped in front of them. He removed his hat. Sanaa did too. This one's her, he said, nodding to the taller marker. Lena, and the smaller one, we never got to name. Sanaa looked down. The soil had settled, the grass around the base turning brown with the season. Jonas knelt and pulled a few weeds from the edge. His hands moved slow like ritual. Then he stood again. I come here every month, more often in the early years. I used to sit here half the day, waiting for something, a sign maybe, and now? Sanaa asked. I just make sure they're not forgotten. They stood in silence for a while, until Sanaa spoke again. Does it feel wrong? That I'm here now? Jonas looked at her fully, eyes steady. No, it feels like something good finally followed all the hurt. She nodded slowly. Then she stepped forward, crouched by the grave, and laid a small bead necklace beside the cross. She'd made it the night before, threaded with shells, bone, a single small blue stone in the center. She didn't explain what it meant. They walked back to the cabin in silence, side by side this time. Later, Sanaa chopped vegetables while Jonas cleaned his rifle at the table. It was the first time she asked about it. Do you still use that? Only when something threatens the animals. Or when I ride into town for supplies. Is it dangerous here? Not usually. But out here, a man's better off being ready. She gave a slow nod. You think someone from my tribe might come looking? Jonas wiped down the rifle barrel. I don't know. Depends on how public your exile was. It was public, she said flatly. They tied me to a post outside the elder's tent while they argued about whether I should be cast out or married off. Jonas looked up sharply. Tied you? She nodded, eyes steady. The cloth I wore then, it tore. That's how the dress ended up the way you found it. He clenched his jaw. You didn't tell me that part. It didn't matter before, she said. But I want you to know it now. Because I chose you. Not out of desperation. But because I wanted someone who wouldn't see me like they did. Jonas stared at her across the table. And how do you think I see you? Like I'm enough. Like I'm not somebody to be blamed or hidden. He stood slowly. Across the room. He took the knife from her hand, set it down gently, and turned her to face him. You're not just enough, he said. You're what's right. She let him hold her, her hands pressed to his chest, fingers curled in the fabric of his shirt. She closed her eyes and breathed him in. His warmth, his steadiness. She let herself feel safe, fully, without flinching. That night, after supper, she undressed without shame. Her dress slid from her shoulders. Her curves were soft, full, her skin warm beneath his hands. He kissed her like he meant it, slow and focused, letting her lead. Her breathing deepened as his hands moved down her back, over her hips. She wasn't rushed. Neither was he. When he laid her down, it wasn't out of want. It was out of connection. His body against hers, his mouth on her skin. She gasped once when his hand moved between her thighs, then pressed closer. They made love without speaking, the firelight flickering across the wall, casting their shadows across the floor. Her back arched, her fingers dug into his arms, and he kissed her again, slow and steady, until they both stilled and lay tangled in warmth and quiet. Afterward, she rested her head against his chest, one leg hooked over his. His hand traced lazy circles on her lower back. I feel like I belong here, she whispered. You do, he said. A beat passed. Then he added, if anyone ever comes for you, I won't let them take you. She didn't reply. She just pulled the blanket over both their shoulders and held them tighter. And in the silence, they both knew something had changed, something final. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a moment. It was the beginning of a life. The sound of rain tapping gently on the roof woke them just after dawn. A soft, steady rhythm. Sanaa was curled against Jonas, her hand resting over his ribs, breath warm on his shoulder. She stirred but didn't open her eyes. Neither of them spoke for a while. Outside, the sky had turned a pale gray. The land was still, blanketed in mist and mud. Jonas shifted carefully, brushing his lips against her hair. We needed the rain, he said. Sanaa murmured, we needed the quiet more. Eventually, they got up. Jonas lit the fire while Sanaa pulled on her coat and stepped barefoot onto the porch. The rain was light but constant, soaking the grass and running in thin lines along the dirt path that led to the barn. She watched it fall, arms crossed over her chest, her long black hair dampening at the ends. Jonas joined her, handing her a mug of coffee. She took it with both hands. I used to like the rain, she said, until the night they left me tied out in it. He didn't say anything, just stood beside her, watching the rain too. She glanced at him, but now I think I'll like it again. They spent the morning inside. Jonas repaired a drawer that had started to splinter near the edge. Sanaa ground cornmeal for bread, humming softly as she worked. She didn't hum often, but when she did, Jonas always paused to listen. At midday, the rain let up. The clouds hung low but broke just enough for some light to filter through. Jonas leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching her as she swept the floor. She wore one of his old shirts now, tied at the waist with a strip of rawhide. It pulled tight at her chest, the fabric stretched slightly where her bust pressed forward. She caught him looking. You've been staring at me more, she said. I'm not trying to hide it. She smiled faintly. You used to. I used to think it was wrong to want anything again. And now, he stood, crossed the room slowly, took her broom from her hands, and set it aside. Now I know it's right. They kissed again, not hurried, not heated, but with the kind of depth that came from knowing, not guessing. Her hands slid to his chest. His moved to the small of her back. The world felt small around them. Focused, but the moment was broken by the sound of hooves. Jonas stepped away quickly, moving to the window. Two riders were approaching from the north trail. He watched them carefully, jaw set. Sanaa had frozen where she stood. Apache. He looked again. No. White men. Well-fed horses. Could be law. Could be traitors. She crossed the room, heart hammering. If they ask about me, they won't. But if they do, Jonas turned to her, firm. You're not going anywhere. He stepped outside before they reached the gate. The two men stopped their horses at the edge of the yard. One of them, the younger one, raised a hand in greeting. The older one stayed still, eyes scanning. Morning, Jonas said flatly. Morning, the younger man replied. Didn't mean to intrude. Looking for a trader's post. We heard there's a trail south from here. Jonas nodded once. Trail's behind a ridge. Keep heading west till you hit a fork. Take the left. You'll find it. You live here alone? The older one asked. Jonas met his eyes directly. I live how I want. The older man held his gaze a moment too long, then finally said, Appreciate the help. They turned and rode on. Jonas waited until the dust settled behind them before going back inside. Sanaa hadn't moved from the window. Her breath was shallow, her fingers tense. They didn't see me, did they? She asked. No, Jonas said. And if they had, it wouldn't matter. She turned to him, voice low. You'd lie for me? I'd fight for you. He crossed to her, touched her cheek. They're just men. What they think don't matter. But if they come back, they won't. Her shoulders dropped. She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her. That night, after supper, Sanaa sat by the fire mending one of his shirts while Jonas read from an old newspaper. She looked up once and said, I don't want to keep living afraid. You won't, he replied. She nodded, then stood and walked toward him, slow and sure. She took the newspaper from his hand and set it aside. Then she climbed into his lap, arms around his neck. Then don't keep living alone, she said. I'm not, he said simply. They kissed again, longer this time. Her shirt slipped off her shoulder, and he traced the edge of her skin with his thumb. She breathed deep against him, her curves soft in his hands. He held her close, grounding her, steadying her. By the time they went to bed, nothing between them was uncertain. She wasn't a guest anymore. She was his, and he was hers. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Sanaa collapsed outside his cabin. The routine they built no longer felt temporary. The cabin, once silent and cold, now held sound. Boots on the floor, pots clinking, fire crackling, soft laughter, occasional humming. Their days were shaped by shared labor. Their nights were shaped by closeness. Jonas had begun to leave the bedroom door open when he rose before dawn. He didn't want to shut her out, not even for a few quiet hours. And Sanaa, she no longer hesitated when she reached for his coat or sat in his chair or stirred the pot he started. There was no asking anymore, only doing, only belonging. That morning, after checking the fence line and feeding the horses, Jonas returned to find her kneeling near the stove, face flushed from the heat. His shirt, really, was damp at the back, clinging to her skin. The neckline hung low over her chest, the buttons loose from wear. She was barefoot, her legs folded under her, humming something soft. He watched her from the doorway for a moment. Just watched. Then she looked up and caught him. Don't just stand there, she said with a crooked smile. You want food or not? I was thinking about something, he said, stepping inside. Dangerous habit. He pulled off his coat and set it on the hook. I've been meaning to go to town. Supplies are low. Nails, coffee, salt, and we could use a new blanket. She paused, wooden spoon in hand. You want me to come with you? Jonas looked at her carefully. I do. She blinked. You're not worried what folks might say? I stopped caring about what folks say a long time ago. She turned back to the pot, but her hand trembled slightly. I haven't walked into a town since they threw me out. What if someone recognizes me? He stepped behind her, rested a hand lightly on her hip. Then they'll see you're not alone. Sanaa leaned back against him slightly. I need a proper dress. You can sew. She looked over her shoulder. And you? You gonna shave that scruff and clean under your nails so you don't scare the children? He grinned. I'll think about it. They spent the rest of the morning preparing. Sanaa pulled out some older cloth he'd forgotten about, set to cutting and stitching. Her new dress, stitched from thick blue cotton, fit snug at the waist with a modest skirt and long sleeves, but the neckline dipped just enough to draw the eye. When she tried it on, Jonas said nothing at first, just stared, then walked over and pressed his mouth to her collarbone. You sure you want to be seen like this in town? He murmured. I want to be seen exactly like this, she said. On your arm. They left the next morning just after sunrise, riding double on his horse, her arms around his waist, her head resting briefly between his shoulder blades as they crossed the hills. Dry Fork hadn't changed much. Wooden storefronts, a dirt road, 2 wagons parked outside the trading post. Folks moved about their business, though a few paused when they saw Jonas ride in. He wasn't known for visiting unless necessary. He dismounted, then helped Sanaa down gently. She adjusted her dress and stood tall, eyes sweeping across the street. A few men paused. A few women whispered, but no one said anything to their face. Jonas stood close to her as they entered the store. She moved quietly beside him, picking out flour, beans, new thread, a scarf in deep red. When they reached the counter, the storekeeper, a gray-haired man named Coyle, looked up. Jonas Hale, he said. Didn't think I'd see you again so soon. Need more than solitude to live, Jonas replied. Coyle's eyes shifted to Sanaa. He gave her a small nod, not unkind, but curious. You new in the territory? Sanaa answered before Jonas could. I'm where I belong. Coyle nodded again, then said nothing more. As they packed the supplies in his saddlebags, a woman came up behind them, young, well-dressed, with tight lips and pale hands. She your squaw? She asked, voice laced with judgment. Jonas turned slow. Sanaa didn't flinch. No, he said. She's my wife. The woman stiffened, then walked away without another word. Sanaa turned to him, eyes wide. That wasn't true, she said under her breath. I didn't feel like explaining anything less than that. She studied him for a long second. You meant it, didn't you? He looked at her without blinking. I don't say things I don't mean. They rode back in silence, but her arms around him were tighter than before. That night, after dinner, she stood by the fire brushing out her hair. The red scarf she'd bought now tied around her neck. Her new dress hung from the wall hook. She wore only her shift, loose and thin, soft against her skin. Her body, full, warm, curved in all the ways that once brought her shame, moved through the room without hesitation. Jonas approached her from behind. His hands slid gently around her waist. You still thinking about what I said? She nodded. He turned her to face him. About land, a cabin, a name. I don't want any of it without you in it. I can't give you a child, she whispered. You don't know that, he said. And I didn't ask for one. She touched his chest. But if I could, we'll take whatever comes. As long as you stay. She kissed him, soft at first, then deeper. They sank into each other like they had nowhere else to be, and no one else in the world mattered. And in that cabin, in the hush between firelight and breath, she finally believed what she never had before. She was worthy, and she was wanted, exactly as she was. The days stretched longer with spring's slow approach. Snow never reached this part of Texas, but the frost had gone from the ground, and green was returning to the hills. The trees behind the barn filled out with new leaves, and wildflowers started showing up along the edges of the fields, soft purple, pale yellow, little signs of season turning. Jonas watched the land from the porch that morning, sipping his coffee. Sanaa stood beside him, arms crossed, her long braid trailing over one shoulder. She was wearing the red scarf, tied neatly at her neck, and the blue dress she'd made hung from her frame like it had always belonged there. Her full figure no longer hid behind shadows or shame. She carried herself openly now, like a woman who knew her worth. She set a hand on her belly. It was a small gesture, quiet, thoughtful. Jonas looked down at her. You feel different? He asked. A little. He waited. She looked up at him, eyes steady. I think I'm pregnant. Jonas didn't speak right away. His fingers tightened slightly around his cup. Are you sure? Not yet, but my body's never been regular. Not since I was a girl. I used to think I was broken. You're not broken, he said softly. She nodded. I know that now. He reached for her hand and brought it to his chest. I didn't think this kind of life was left for me, he said. But here you are. They stood like that for a long while, listening to the morning. A week passed. Sanaa's suspicions grew more certain. Her appetite changed. Her body began to ache differently, and she moved with a slowness she hadn't before. Jonas built her a cushioned seat out of scrap wood and lined it with hides so she could rest near the fire while sewing. He was quiet about it all, gentle, steady, never rushing her. But she noticed the way his hands lingered over her hip when he helped her up, the way he stood close when she walked through the yard. How often he watched her now, not just with want, but with care. One evening, after supper, she sat at the table staring at the wooden bead necklace she had once laid on Lena's grave. She'd retrieved it days ago, dusted it clean, kept it nearby. Would you be willing to marry me? She asked, voice low but direct. Jonas looked up from the stove. He didn't act surprised. I was going to ask you the same thing. Why haven't you? I figured you should ask if you were ready, he said. She smiled. I am. Jonas stepped over, dropped to one knee, not for drama, just instinct. His hand found hers. I want to build the rest of this life with you, Sanaa. You and whoever else comes with it. She brushed her fingers through his hair. Then it settled. The next morning, he rode into Dry Fork again, alone this time, to speak with the pastor and secure the license. He returned before dusk, dust on his boots, a slip of paper folded neatly in his shirt pocket. They married 2 days later under the cottonwood tree behind the barn, the same one he'd planted years ago over Lena's grave. It was tall now, not grand, but strong. There was no crowd, no music, just the preacher, Jonas, Sanaa, and the wind. Sanaa wore the same blue dress, her hair braided and wrapped with leather and feathers. Jonas wore a clean shirt, his beard trimmed, boots polished. As they said their vows, he didn't look away from her once. When the preacher told him to speak, he only said, I want her. I choose her. For the rest of my life. Sanaa's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Her hands were steady when she said, I have nowhere else in the world I'd rather be. You've given me shelter. Now I'll give you everything I am. They sealed it with a kiss, soft, long, grounded. That night, back in the cabin, they lit no lamp. The fire was enough. She stood in the center of the room, barefoot, pregnant, beautiful. He undressed her slow, piece by piece, as if memorizing every curve again. She didn't hide. Her body, once scorned, now sacred. When they lay together, it wasn't need. It was belonging. He held her belly between his hands and pressed his mouth to the skin there. Her breath caught in her throat. I don't care if it's a boy or girl, he said. I just wanted to know it was wanted. And I wanted to know I was too, she whispered. Weeks passed. They worked the land, prepared the cradle together. The townsfolk, once curious, now nodded to her with respect. Coyle at the store called her Mrs. Hale without hesitation. The woman who had once judged her stayed quiet the next time they crossed paths. Sanaa had not only found a place, she had built one. With Jonas, with her hands, with her heart. One evening, as they watched the sun dip low across the valley, Sanaa reached for his hand and placed it over her stomach. I feel it, she whispered. Jonas blinked, held his breath, then smiled slow, deep. And as the wind moved across their land, nothing else was said. There were no more questions left unanswered, no more shame unspoken, no more belonging left to seek. She had stayed. He had stayed. And now, a family was growing from the silence they once shared.